Be with us this morning, God. Quiet our hearts. May our spirits be still, that we might hear from you. Amen. In 1997, the film As Good as It Gets won the Best Picture at the Academy Awards. For his part, Jack Nicholson won the Oscar for Best Actor for his role as novelist Melvin Udall, a self-absorbed, impatient curmudgeon. And as that movie progresses, Melvin grows attached to Helen Hunt's character, Carol Connolly, a waitress at the diner he eats in each morning. Well, Way ultimately leads on to Way, and eventually the two strike up a kind of relationship, one where we as the viewer see that Carol's presence in Udall's life is slowly beginning to change him and soften him and open him up, which leads to the movie's most iconic scene. Toward the end of the film, Carol and Melvin are having dinner together. Melvin is trying to make up for some offensive things that he'd said to her the last time they'd been together. And he's stumbling around his words, and he knows he's not yet conveyed that which he ultimately wants to express. And so he pauses, and he gathers himself, and then he finds these words that are now iconic in modern cinematic history. He looks at her and he clarifies, "You make me want to be a better man." It's a great line and a great film, and if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you do. But the reason I bring it up this morning is this. The power of that now famous line, the reason that line is so moving, is because of what it implies about human character development. Melvin doesn't say to her, "You have made me a better man," as if the process is now complete. He says to her, "You make me want to be a better man," as if the process is ongoing. And the difference between those two things is all the difference in the world. Which brings me to C.S. Lewis. I know everybody's shocked. In Mere Christianity, Lewis reflects on the process of human character development, and he goes on to analyze one of the most universal abiding criticisms of the Christian faith. The Christian faith is often criticized for the fact that when you look at Christians, there are many Christians who do not appear to be better people than many of those who are not Christians. It's an argument that's been leveled against Christianity since the earliest days of the faith, and it takes only the tiniest fraction of honesty and self-awareness for us to realize that that criticism is fair. For I know very fine atheists and agnostics, people who, strictly speaking, are far nicer, far kinder, far more selfless people than many Christians I know. In many cases, far nicer, far kinder, far more selfless than I am myself, and I'm a Christian pastor. So what are we to do with this fact? Well, we do well by considering it and unpacking it. And when we do, here's the logic that underpins this particular criticism. People look at it like this. If Christianity is true, then those who are Christians ought to be better people than those who aren't. Many people who are not Christians are better people than those who are. Therefore, Christianity is not true. It's an airtight syllogism. The conclusion follows the premises. In Logic 101, they'd say that the argument holds. Thus, sadly, this is the grounds by which many conclude that there's nothing particularly true about Christianity, which is heartbreaking. And it is so for many reasons, not the least of which being that if we take a closer look at that logic, we find that there was a glaring mistake in the major premise, which is to say that Christians don't profess to be better people than those who are not Christians. That is a common misconception both from those within Christianity and those without. Christianity doesn't profess to make people better people than those who are not Christians. No, Christianity professes to make Christians better people than they themselves were the day before. And thus, as C.S. Lewis points out, the test for whether Christianity is true or not then ought not to be how a Christian compares to someone else, but simply ought to be how a Christian, him or herself, compares to him or herself from the day before. Which leads us to the Apostle Paul. In Paul's letter to the Philippians, he reflects on the character development that he himself has experienced since his own dramatic conversion to Christianity. And he explains to the Philippians how, prior to surrendering his life to Christ, he'd been a man of great repute. He talks about how educated he was, and how accomplished he was, and how respected he was, and how recognized he was, and how morally upright he was. But then he goes on to explain how over time he'd begun to count all these things as meaningless. Because the more he began to pursue Christ's righteousness, the more he realized that what mattered was simply being like Christ. And thus the more he tried to be like Christ, the more Christ-like he became. But then paradoxically, the more Christ-like he became, the more he realized how un-Christ-like he really was. And that's why in the letter from Philippians that we read this morning, we can hear Paul writing so powerfully and encouragingly and hopefully about the Christian aim of becoming like Christ. It's because he'd watched himself undergo this massive, deep inner change at the core of his being. But yet it's also why we can hear in that same letter Paul go on to say, this is not to say that I have obtained that righteousness, but nonetheless I press on. I want us to pause for just a minute on that particular sentence, because for me that sentence leaps off the page of the text. Because if Paul, a man who went through beatings and floggings and imprisonments and poverty and heavens knows what all else, all for the sake of becoming like more Christ, of becoming more righteous, if Paul himself had not obtained that which he was seeking after, then what does that mean for us and for our ability to actually obtain it? A question that leads me back to Jack Nicholson and his lovably unlovable character, Melvin Udall. Though it sounds strange, particularly if you've seen that movie, Melvin Udall is an apt symbol of what it means to be a Christian. Because far from the popular image of a Christian being a put-together, ever-selfless, philanthropic, moral exemplar, instead, the Christian knows himself to be a broken, self-centered, self-absorbed human being. A human being who, grasped by undeserved love, now wants desperately to be a better human being. Or put better, wants desperately to be the person he or she feels he is being called to be. And moreover, and this is vitally important, the Christian, like Melvin Udall, knows this doesn't just happen. The Christian knows that he can't just take a pill, or don a cape, or pull on a mask, or say a simple prayer, and then suddenly be exactly who he or she wants to be. No, instead, the Christian knows that in order to be Christ-like, it will require a process of becoming. A process laden with advances and setbacks, with gains and losses, with joys and shortcomings. And most importantly, the Christian knows that the more Christ-like he becomes, the farther he or she will realize they have to go. C.S. Lewis writes in Mere Christianity, every time you make a choice, you are turning the central part of you, the part of you that chooses, into something a little different than it was before. And taking your life as a whole, with all your innumerable choices, all your life long, you are slowly turning this central thing into a heavenly creature or a hellish creature. Either into a creature that is in harmony with God and with other creatures and with itself, or else into one that is in a state of war and hatred with God and with other creatures and with itself. To be the one kind of creature is heaven, that is joy and peace and knowledge and power. To be the other means madness, horror, idiocy, rage, and eternal loneliness. Each of us, at each moment, is progressing from the one state to the other. This Lenten season, we do well to reflect on those words. We do well to reflect on the moment-by-moment process of becoming. Because the simple truth is that we like to think of our faith and our Christian righteousness as a found and settled thing, as if our journey to righteousness has already been confirmed, simply because we believed the right set of propositions. But Lent's about recognizing that it doesn't work this way. Lent's about recognizing that our encounter of God is just the beginning of our Christian journey. Lent's about reminding us that to be in Christ is to become like Christ. And Lent's about reminding us that to become like Christ doesn't and cannot just happen overnight. Every moment of every day, C.S. Lewis says, we have the opportunity to become a little more like Christ. Every day we have the opportunity to respond to slight with forgiveness, to respond to bitterness with warmth. Every day we have the opportunity to serve someone rather than wait for them to serve us. The opportunity to give someone a compliment rather than make a passive cut. Opportunity to simply open the door for someone, to smile at someone, to ask someone how they're doing, and actually care what their answer is. These things seem like such small and insignificant acts. They're certainly not as grandiose and on as big a scale as Mary taking perfume and wiping Jesus' feet with her hair. But the inescapable fact is that our very character is constituted by the sum total of these small, seemingly insignificant acts. And thus, taking your life as a whole, as Lewis says, with all of its innumerable choices, you're slowly turning the central part of you into a heavenly creature or a hellish creature. To be the one kind is heaven, that is, it is joy and peace and knowledge and power. To be the other kind means madness, horror, idiocy, rage, emptiness, and eternal loneliness. Each of us, at each moment, is progressing to the one state or the other. In the end, Christianity is about our becoming not just better people, but becoming the very people God designed each one of us to be. And every moment presents us an opportunity to take one step closer to that call on our lives. Would that we recognize that. And would that we focus not just on the destination, but also on the journey that leads us there. Would that we see the chasm that yawns between who we currently are and who we are supposed to be, and being not daunted, having our eyes set on that which lies before us, would that we have the courage, like the Apostle Paul, to having known that we have not yet obtained it, to nonetheless press on. Amen.